excited to bring you our last lesson on the amazing life of Joseph. So last week we read that Joseph was in prison with two other Egyptian men. Do you remember who they were? The cupbearer and the baker. So both of these men had a dream, and they were really worried because they didn't know what their dreams meant. They asked Joseph, and Joseph told them that he was able to tell them what their dreams meant because he walked with God, and God would reveal to Joseph what the dreams meant. The cupbearer's dream meant that he would be returned to Pharaoh's service in 3 days. Joseph asked the cupbearer when he went back to serving Pharaoh if he would please tell Pharaoh that Joseph was an innocent man. He was a good man who was in prison for no reason, and if the Pharaoh would release Joseph from prison because he hadn't done anything wrong. Well, did the cupbearer remember to tell Pharaoh about Joseph? No. Sadly, Joseph was in prison for 2 more years. Joseph may have felt forgotten in that prison, but we know that God never forgets his children, and God never forgot Joseph. Well, our story continues. One night, Pharaoh had 2 really weird dreams. One of them was about cows, and one of them was about grain. He woke up and he was really confused about what these weird dreams must mean. So he asked all kinds of smart people and wise men and magicians if they could figure out what his dreams meant. But no one knew what the dreams meant. Finally, the cupbearer thought, oh, I know a guy. He remembered Joseph 2 years ago had been able to tell him what his dream meant. So he told Pharaoh about Joseph. Genesis 41 verses 15 through 16 says, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream. No one can tell me what it means, but I've heard that when you hear a dream, you can explain it. I can't do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he wants. Joseph didn't take credit for being able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams all by himself. He knew that his ability to interpret dreams came from God and God alone. So Pharaoh told his dreams to Joseph. Joseph told Pharaoh that both of his dreams had the same meaning. For 7 years, there would be an abundant harvest in the land of Egypt. The ground would produce so much crops that there would be all kinds of extra food and grain. After the 7 years of plenty, there would come 7 years of famine. The ground wouldn't produce food, and there wouldn't be enough to eat. The people would be very hungry to the point of starving. God gave these dreams to Pharaoh so that he would be able to prepare for the famine that was coming. God sent Joseph to warn Pharaoh so they'd be ready for the 7 years of famine. Joseph told Pharaoh to choose a wise and understanding man to be in charge during the 7 plentiful years of harvest. That way, they could collect grain and store grain for when they had the 7 years of famine. Pharaoh thought that this was a great plan, and he thought really hard about who he was going to put in charge. Let's read from Genesis chapter 41, verses 38 through 40. So Pharaoh said, "The Spirit of God is in this man. We can't find anyone else like him, can we?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "God has made all of this known to you. No one is as wise and as understanding as you are. You will be in charge of my palace. All of my people must obey your orders. I will be greater than you, only because I'm the one who sits on the throne." Can you imagine the surprised look on Joseph's face? I want you to give me your best surprise face. Ready? Okay, so Joseph was probably super surprised. Next to Pharaoh, Joseph would be the most powerful man in all of Egypt. Just a few hours before, he was a slave and a prisoner. Once again, God can turn any situation upside down. Now Joseph had the power to give orders that the Egyptians must obey. So for 7 years, the land produced tons and tons of food, and Joseph had the people store up the food and grain so they would have plenty during the years of famine. During this time, God even blessed Joseph with 2 sons. Finally, the 7 abundant years in Egypt came to an end, and just like Joseph had predicted through God, famine came. Thankfully, Joseph's plan provided plenty of food for everyone who needed it during that time of famine. So, what do you think was happening with Joseph's family back in Canaan? This famine not only affected Egypt, but this famine affected the whole wide world. By this time, many of Joseph's brothers were married and had children, and Jacob's large family was about to run out of food. And if they didn't find food soon, they were going to starve. Jacob was very upset about the food shortage, and he had heard that there was lots of extra food and grain in Egypt. So he sent all of his sons, except for Benjamin, to Egypt to buy more food. Now, Benjamin was the youngest of all the boys. If you remember, Benjamin and Joseph were sons of Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel, and they were her only sons. So just like Joseph was Jacob's favorite, now he's favoring Benjamin, and he didn't want him to take the dangerous journey to Egypt. So Joseph's 10 other brothers took silver coins and traveled over 200 miles to Egypt. This would have taken around 10 days on the back of a donkey. Genesis 42 verse 6 says, "When Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground." Wait a minute, this sounds familiar. Wow, do you remember the dream that God gave to Joseph way back when he was just a teenager, that his brothers would bow down before him? Well, here we see that this is actually happening. Joseph's dream had come true. Joseph's brothers didn't recognize him. They didn't know that it was Joseph that was this ruler in Egypt. The last time they saw Joseph, he was just a teenager, about 17 years old, and now he was a grown man. They didn't know that the slave traders had taken him to Egypt. They thought that he was probably dead. They thought that this important ruler was an Egyptian, not an Israelite. This ruler was using a translator and not talking in their Hebrew language. So they had no idea that this was Joseph, but Joseph immediately recognized his brothers. Can you imagine what Joseph must have felt when he saw them? His stomach was probably turning in knots. So everybody close your eyes for just a minute. Pretend that you're Joseph and imagine you're sitting there in your fancy Egyptian robe and you're on a throne, a platform above your 10 brothers. Your mind flashes back to the last time that you saw them. You remember what they did to you. They beat you up. They ripped off your beautiful, colorful coat and threw you in a pit to basically leave you for dead. They decided not to kill you, but instead sold you as a slave, and you've spent years as a slave and then as a falsely accused prisoner. Think for a minute about what you might say to these brothers, or what you might do now that you're the one in the position of power and you have power over their lives. All right, so open your eyes. The natural human response would be to take revenge. We can imagine Joseph saying, "You almost killed me, and then you sold me as a slave. Why should I give you anything to eat? Go get your own food." By God's grace, though, Joseph realized that God had a purpose for placing him in power over his brothers. And Joseph was not going to use his power to get revenge. Our human nature wants to hurt people that have hurt us. But God's grace can help us to say no to revenge and to be kind to people who have been unkind to us. So Joseph met with the brothers and sent them back home with just a little bit of grain and food, and told them that they could only come back and they'd get more if they would bring their younger brother Benjamin back to Egypt. Joseph kept his brother Simeon in prison in Egypt to ensure that the brothers would come back. So the brothers traveled back home, and they arrived and told Jacob about everything that had happened. Jacob refused to allow them to go back to Egypt with Benjamin. He was going to leave Simeon in prison forever because he favorited his son Benjamin and didn't want Benjamin to get hurt. So the food that Joseph had given his brothers, it didn't last forever. After some time, probably a couple months, the food that he had given his brothers ran out, and Jacob had to do something to feed his family. He told his sons to go back to Egypt to buy more food. Judah spoke up and reminded Jacob that they couldn't get more food unless they brought their brother Benjamin, that was the deal that the Egyptian ruler had made. To calm his father, Judah promised to keep Benjamin safe, no matter what. And finally, Judah agreed to let Benjamin go with his brothers. When Joseph saw his brothers coming with Benjamin, he told his servants to prepare a huge meal for all the brothers. The brothers were taken to Joseph's house, and Simeon was released from prison, just as Joseph had promised. Let's read Genesis 49, verses 29 and 30. It says, Joseph looked around. Then he saw his brother Benjamin, his own mother's son. He asked, "Is this your youngest brother? Is he the one you told me about?" He continued, "May God be gracious to you, my son." It moved him deeply to see his brother. So Joseph hurried out and looked for a place to cry. He went into his own room and cried there. Joseph was overwhelmed to see his little brother. The last time he had seen his family, he was 17 years old, and Benjamin was just a little kid. Joseph couldn't hold back his tears, so he ran out of the room. When he calmed down, he returned and ordered that lunch be served. So the brothers were seated in order from oldest to youngest. Now, the brothers thought this was really weird. Maybe if the brothers were still kids, you could have picked out who was the oldest and who was the youngest, but the brothers were all grown, and it would have been impossible for an outsider to know their ages from oldest to youngest. And also, as the food was served, Benjamin was given 5 times as much food as his brothers. The next morning, the brothers were packing to head to Canaan with as much food as they could carry. Then Joseph gave his servant an unusual order. He told his servant to put his special silver cup in Benjamin's sack. Let's see what happens in Genesis 44, verses 1 through 10. They hadn't gone very far from the city when Joseph spoke to his servant. "Go after those men at once," he said. "Catch up with them. Say to them, 'My master was good to you. Why have you paid him back doing evil? Isn't this the cup my master drinks from? Doesn't he also use it to figure things out? You have done an evil thing.'" When the servant caught up with them, he told them what Joseph had said. But they said to him, "Why do you say these things? We would never do anything like that. We even brought back to you from Canaan the money we found in our sacks. So why would we steal silver or gold from your master's house? If you find out that any of us has the cup, he will die, and the rest of us will become your slaves." "All right then," he said. "As you wish. The one who is found to have the cup will become my slave, but the rest of you will be free from blame." The men pulled the sacks down off their donkeys. The servant checked in each man's bag, and what do you think he found when he got to Benjamin's bag? He found Joseph's silver cup. The brothers were shocked and very sad that Benjamin was the one that was guilty. They all loaded their donkeys and headed back to Joseph's house. When they arrived, they threw themselves on the ground and begged Joseph to let Benjamin go free. They begged for mercy. They said that they would all become Joseph's slaves, so Benjamin didn't have to. Joseph said that this wouldn't be fair. Only Benjamin, the one who was guilty, needed to be his slave. But Judah stepped forward. Remember, Judah was the brother that had sold Joseph into slavery all those years before. And Judah was the brother that had promised their father Jacob to keep Benjamin safe. So Judah stepped forward and he said that he would go in Benjamin's place, that Joseph could keep Judah as a slave and let Benjamin go free. Now, instead of selling his brother into slavery, Judah is begging to be a slave in the place of his brother. Isn't this a huge change in Judah's heart? Repentance is changing your mind, causing you to turn away from sin and turn to following God. Joseph had been testing his brothers to see if they really had a change of heart, if they had really repented. If they hadn't repented, they would have been furious that Benjamin had received 5 times as much food as they had. They would have easily let Benjamin go back to be Joseph's slave. If they hadn't repented, Judah would have never begged to take Benjamin's place instead. But all of this evidence that they really had a true change of heart, that Joseph's brothers had really repented. Remember, the brothers still had no idea who Joseph was. So Joseph was so filled with joy over his brother's change of heart that he ordered all of his slaves to leave the room. In Genesis 45, verses 3 and 4, it says, Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers weren't able to answer him. They were too afraid of him. Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." So they did. Then he said, "I am your brother, Joseph. I am the one you sold into Egypt." Can you imagine what his brothers must have been thinking? They were stunned. Like we said, up until this point, they thought he was Egyptian, some powerful ruler. And at this moment, he had used an interpreter to speak to them, but now he's speaking to them in their own language and telling them that he is their brother, Joseph. Let's imagine the thoughts that must have been racing through their head. On the one hand, they realized how wrong they were to sell Joseph into slavery, and they must have been thrilled that he was alive and well. The text mentions several times that they thought that Joseph was dead at this point, so they must have been so happy that he was alive. On the other hand, though, their long-lost brother was the second most powerful man in the whole world, and now he had the power to take revenge on them if he wanted to. Let's listen carefully to Joseph's next words in Genesis chapter 45, verses 5 through 8. Joseph said to them, "But don't be upset, and don't be angry with yourselves because you sold me here. God sent me ahead of you to save many lives. For 2 years now, there hasn't been enough food in the land, and for the next 5 years, people won't be plowing or gathering crops. But God sent me ahead of you to keep some of you alive on earth. He sent me here to save your lives by an act of mighty power. So then it wasn't you who sent me here, it was God." Wow. Joseph made it clear that he was not going to take revenge on his brothers. Not only did he forgive them, he also didn't even want them to feel bad for what they'd done. Joseph was able to look at this situation through kingdom eyes. He saw his life the way God saw it, as part of God's big, amazing plan to preserve and protect the family of Abraham. Without Joseph's provision in the crops, a lot of Abraham's descendants could have died. Joseph's amazing life was God's way of keeping his promise, and we know that God always keeps his promises. Joseph was so glad to be reunited to his brothers, and do you know who else he wanted to be reunited with? His father. He told his brothers to go home to Canaan and tell Jacob everything that had happened, that Joseph was alive, and that there would still be 5 more years of famine, and that Jacob and the whole family could come to Egypt so they could live and have enough food to eat. So the men hugged each other, the brothers accepted Joseph's forgiveness, and they headed back to Canaan to go tell Jacob everything that had happened. Genesis 45, verses 26 through 28 says, "They told him, their father Jacob, 'Joseph is still alive. In fact, he's ruler of the whole land of Egypt.' Jacob was shocked. He didn't believe them, so they told him everything Joseph had said to them. Jacob saw the carts Joseph had sent to carry him back. That gave new life to their father Jacob. He said, 'I believe it now. My son Joseph is alive. I'll go and see him before I die.' So Jacob and his family brought all their belongings and headed for Egypt. Altogether, counting all the sons, their wives, and their children, there were now over 70 people traveling to Egypt. As soon as Joseph heard that his family was arriving, he got in his chariot and raced to meet his father. Genesis 46, verses 29 and 30 says, "As soon as he came to his father, Joseph threw his arms around him. Then Joseph sobbed for a long time. Jacob said to Joseph, 'I have seen for myself that you are still alive. Now I'm ready to die.' Jacob meant that he could die happy, since he had seen that his son was alive and well. Joseph went to tell Pharaoh that his family had come to Egypt. They were shepherds, and Pharaoh told them that they were welcome to live in the land of Goshen. Joseph made sure that his father, brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews had plenty of food to eat. And Jacob's family, the Israelites, gained more property, and their numbers grew greatly. Joseph listened to God in every step of his life, even when it was hard, even when it didn't make sense, even when it felt like God was far away. Joseph still trusted and still obeyed the Lord, and God kept his promises to Joseph. And because of Joseph's obedience, Joseph, his family, and the whole entire world was blessed. We each have the same opportunities as the people we talk to today. By God's grace, he gives us many promises that we don't deserve. And we know that God always keeps his promises. If you trust his promises, you will live life according to God's word. We have seen God keep his promises time and time again in the Bible. Are you willing to trust God and his promises in your own life? So I encourage you in this amazing story of Joseph that you live your life like Joseph, trusting God and obeying him and giving him the glory for everything that we do. Thanks, guys.